this framing of, because at least for me growing up, my education in the US was often framed as, you have communist command economies and then you have democratic free market economies. And, you choose one or the other and you can guess which one was the good one and which one was the bad one.
The important question for me is planning is coming anyway. How can we organize it democratically? How can we orient it towards needs within planetary boundaries?
Whenever you're talking about socialism, they try to pigeonhole you into like there's one monolithic type of socialist economics and it's failed every time, but I think it's a lot more complicated than that.
But there's a lot of things that are profitable that are not as desirable for societies, like fossil fuels, still insanely profitable, and we need to decarbonize the economy for the climate crisis.
This episode is sponsored by NIM, the world's most private VPN that protects your internet traffic and metadata. Unlike traditional VPNs, NIM uses a decentralized mixnet to scramble your internet data, hiding who you're talking to, when, and how often. You can switch between full mixnet mode for maximum anonymity or a faster VPN mode for everyday use. Pay in crypto or fiat, and even your payment stays anonymous thanks to ZK-powered anonymous credentials. Take back control of your online life at nim.com. Sign up today using the code BlockchainSocialist and get an extra month for free. So, hi everyone, you're listening to the Blockchain Socialist podcast, and today I am here with Christoph Sorg. He is a social scientist and researcher at Humboldt University in Berlin, and he is also the co-author of a recent book called Creative Construction, Democratic Planning in the 21st Century and Beyond. I wanted to have him on in main part to talk about a recent publication as well that he did called Finance as a Form of Economic Planning. In case this kind of sounds a little bit strange to you, it doesn't really make too much sense. Basically, one of the kind of questions that I have been kind of tackling with a lot of my work is thinking about, in the context maybe in particular with cryptocurrency and blockchains, this idea of economic planning and how it differs and how it can manifest itself in various ways, involving technology or not is kind of an interesting problem space, but in particular, in my work in relation to the blockchain space, as opposed to, free market fundamentalism and what are the differences, what are the pros and cons. Generally, on the left, historically, socialists have been pro-democratic or economic planning. The democratic part is maybe my preference, whereas maybe on the right, people tend to be much more pro-free markets. But before I get into that, maybe we can start off, Christoph. We met previously when I came to an event that was a talk by Michael McCarthy for his recent book as well. So we've met before, but for the audience, would you like to give an introduction to yourself and your work? And maybe provide a little summary of the high-level context around this question of economic planning.
Cool. Yeah, happy to do that. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here. So my work, I'm a social scientist. I'm broadly interested in theories of capitalism and post-capitalism. I just finished a project at Humboldt University in Berlin called Capitalist Planned Economies, in which I basically try to do research on the question of whether planning is already endemic in capitalism, what does it mean to say that there's planning in capitalism, and so on and so forth. But it's always related to the question of whether, if we have planning already, how could this be democratized? How could it be organized differently? That's basically what I'm doing. And right now, I'm in California. I'm a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley this semester. I'm traveling California to do research on public banks. As a kind of do research is maybe a bit exaggerated. This is exploratory research. I'm trying to build a research project because there's been a kind of a new activist coalition that managed to push through a law that there can be public banks in California. And it's something I'm engaging with. I'm thinking about what social movements to democratize and socialize investment could be. This is something I'm trying to learn about. So this is kind of my relationship to this topic, because for me, planning, maybe the most important part of planning for me, of democratic planning, is democratizing investment.
Yeah, so maybe to kind of take a step back, 'cause I think what you said is interesting, is that you're doing research on this kind of maybe, what's the word, framing of the problem that you wouldn't normally have. Like, capitalism as an economic system as something that is already planned, or that there is planning inside of capitalism to a large extent. Would you say that is kind of, to me, this is kind of like this was like a kind of light bulb moment that I had quite some time ago about like actually this framing of, because at least for me growing up, my education in the US was often framed as, you have communist command economies and then you have democratic free market economies, and you choose one or the other and you can guess which one was the good one and which one was the bad one. So I'm wondering if you can like untangle that a little bit on like, yeah, why is it kind of weird to say that there's planning under capitalism, I guess, for some people.
Yeah. So I've engaged with this binary of you have capitalist markets versus socialist planning for a while. And for me, this used to be a question of thinking about feminist critiques or post-colonial critiques of markets, like who are the people who don't really have access to this market. There's a lot about that. It was also I studied global history. There was some interesting accounts. I'm not an expert on Chinese history, but it's something I just engaged with for a little bit, of question of, did pre-capitalist China have relatively developed markets, but not a kind of capitalist market economy? Markets are older than capitalism. So if capitalism is not only markets, this is kind of destabilizing one side of this binary already. Also, socialist Yugoslavia and theories of market socialism have shown that you could have a socialist market economy. This again destabilizing this equation. But more recently, I've been more interested in thinking about planning and capitalism, and there's a bigger legacy to that. So this is a kind of hinge I have. Like I think my impression is that this has been decades of neoliberalism where this talking about planning capitalism seems kind of a bit weird. But if you look at a lot of the literature from the 1950s and 60s, standard sociological literature at the time is discussing the rise of planning in modernity. This is a kind of classical canon in sociology. Jürgen Habermas, one of the most important philosophers at the time, his disciple Klaus Offe, they talk about the kind of the exponential increase of planning in capitalism. You have people talking about monopoly capitalism. Markets are kind of disappearing and just have organized markets and monopolies and so on and so forth. So this is a kind of discourse, and this is basically just disappeared because of the rise of neoliberalism. But this used to not be like a crazy idea. If you look at the way this the way this returned for me I think there's two important elements. There's been different forms of academic research, like different empirical research, people who look at very different fields and who realize that planning is a really meaningful concept for them. They find that there's an increase of planning of some sort. This is very different literature. So you have in the political economy of finance, you have people who look at central banks and they realize central banks aren't those neutral actors. They're actually engaging in planning. They really try to structure markets, but they do so in a very technocratic way. Then people who look at asset managers and universal ownership theory, they realize that asset managers start to own shares in competing companies and increasingly socialize the market in a way. And so in a way, they could, in principle, be kind of seen as social planners of markets because they kind of own a large share of the overall market. They don't do so. This is also empirical. They don't really act as planners, but this is just an engagement with the concept. Others look at the platform economy, digital platform, those large monopolies. They also plan markets in a sense because they can control all the variables that make up the market design. And then I could talk for hours. I just break it down. The biggest one is maybe the new state capitalism, this kind of literature. They argue that on a global scale, there's an increase of organized state-owned companies, sovereign wealth funds, heavy industrial policy, new investment banks, and so on and so forth. So there's different bodies of literature who argue that markets are increasingly planned and states increasingly intervene in markets with planning. And this is happening on a global scale. I think this is one big thing. And the other big thing is that progressives don't seem to there's a lack of like an overall vision. In German, you'd say a bracket, a unifying bracket that can kind of bring together different ideas of social transformation under a bigger label. And at least in Germany, but also in some other countries, democratic planning has served as such a bracket, like conscious, deliberate structuring of social life to ensure freedom, security, equality, democracy, and so on. This is, I think, what democratic planning
Yeah,
also
definitely.
is.
I definitely want to get into this, into democratic planning. I think this is one of the kind of concepts that I came across in my kind of, political education. That was kind of that one of the aha moments of like, oh, this is clearly a direction that we should be going in, which I think is also an interesting one because I think I would love to hear your thoughts like later. I have some thoughts about like how democratic planning actually kind of looks like markets in many ways, but is not like a market as we know it. But before we get there, one of the things that I want to touch on as well that I think is important information for people to understand, because you're talking about kind of the history of it, is the what's termed as the socialist calculation debate. So I think this is kind of like an interesting thing for people to know about and understand when thinking about these questions, that it was something that was like actively debated upon in history, and a lot of kind of the I think a lot of I guess I kind of frame it as like the socialists versus what came to become the neoliberals kind of came out of this like academic discussion that was going on in the background of history. But you want to explain that a little bit? And maybe did someone win that debate? Good to know.
It's the title of an interesting paper by John O'Neill, Who Won the
Mm-hmm.
Socialist Calculation Debate? And I think the answer has been kind of shifting in a sense. Maybe it's just saying something in beforehand about why this
Mm-hmm.
debate is so important, at least two reasons. So if what I said earlier is true, if planning is really increasingly important, and if we relate this to the polycrisis, and if planning is necessary to solve the ecological crisis, the care crisis, and so on and so forth, which I would argue it is, because planning is the only way to to organize sections of life that aren't really
Mm-hmm.
served by the profit motive. If this is true, then the important question for me is planning is coming anyway. How can we organize it democratically? How can we orient it towards needs within planetary boundaries? That's my formula. And so the people who kind of have tackled this question have been the people who were involved in the socialist calculation debate, which is basically starting in the 1920s, and not by accident, because you basically have this Bolshevist revolution. And for the first time, so you had theoretical debates beforehand about what a socialist economy could look like, but then you have the emergence of an actually existing socialist economy. And then that really poses, and plus you have the First World War, and modern wars are instances where governments
Yeah.
don't trust markets with outcomes, where it's
Yeah.
far too important. You can't just let the market, the spontaneous market, reign on its own. You really structure economic
Mm-hmm.
production for the war outcome. Not to
Sure.
romanticize
Sure.
wars, not by a long shot, but like just this basically posing the question of how do you plan a modern economy? This question is practically posed in the wars. And so out of this kind of experience comes the question of, can a socialist economy be rationally planned? And is it desirable? And so you have, in the beginning, you have Marxists like Otto Neurath, who has experience in wartime planning, practical wartime planning. He basically argues that you could plan an economy, and it would be a kind of in-kind planning, which means not based on prices, but on in-kind kind of variables. So hours of labor, tons of steel, and so on. And right from the beginning, you have a counter side, the Austrian School of Economics, which is basically arguing that if you don't have prices, you can't commensurate things. You can't compare different forms of production if you don't know the prices. Prices make things comparable. This is the early debate. And then basically, to break it down, there's several waves of this debate throughout the 20th century. It's a very complicated debate, but it's really worthwhile engaging with it, because a lot of the important social science, economics, political science concepts come out of this debate, especially
Mm-hmm.
ecological economics. Things like incommensurability, that some things just aren't comparable, or externalities,
Mm-hmm.
very important concept in economics. That comes out of
Oh,
this
okay. Yeah.
debate in some form or another. And so in the beginning, by the mid 20th century, I'd argue that the socialists have essentially won. You have Josef Schumpeter, always give this example because he's a liberal conservative, and he essentially argues that, of course, in his book Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy, he says, of course, you can plan an economy, and he kind of rips on socialist economists, is basically arguing that the socialists are so stupid that you need bourgeois economists to explain business to them because they don't know how to run their own economy. Bit like that. But in doing so, he really acknowledges, of course, you can plan an economy. And he's kind of melancholic because he says it's so much more efficient This is the way things are gonna, like the modern corporation, which is a large sphere of economic planning and which is getting rid of the market by just dictating prices in an administrative way. This is, all of this is winning, and he's a bit melancholic because it's destroying what he likes about the market economy anyway, roughly like that. So, and Friedrich August von Hayek, who's the kind of probably the most important Austrian economist of the Austrian School of Economics, is furious at the time because he argues that with Schumpeter writing this, the mainstream absolutely accepts the possibility of socialist planning, and his position becomes relatively marginal at the time. And that shifts again in the 1970s, 80s, when it becomes apparent that there's a lot of contradictions with the three big forms of planning at the time. You have Western Keynesian planning, has a big crisis with the stagflation crisis. Global South-based developmentalist planning has a big crisis with the Southern debt crisis. And also Eastern state socialism, central planning becomes apparent as becomes relatively bureaucratic. The contradictions become more visible. Whereas in the 50s, it looked like this is the biggest, most rapid industrialization in human history. This is insanely productive. Like this was the narrative beforehand in the mainstream. So there's really a shift in discourse because there's a crisis, and also the neoliberals attack at the time. And they win the battle of ideas, but they also, maybe more importantly, they win the battle of politics. And wherever you have socialist attempts for socialist planning at the time, they kind of, in the East you have reforms. In the South, you have a turn from this kind of more experience with developmentalist planning to more export-oriented industrialization and structural adjustment. And in the global North, you have rise of neoliberalism as an alternative to Keynesianism. So planning becomes more like a dirty word. Markets become more positively connotated. And I think this is still the status quo to a certain extent, but I'd argue that the North Atlantic financial crisis in 2008, the climate crisis, and other, like the Polish crisis overall, have started to shift this debate again.
So, and yeah, I think it's fascinating to think about, in the 50s, during this time, my understanding is for much of the political class, I guess you can call it, just like for a lot of people, socialism seemed like the obvious answer, or planning economies seemed like the obvious answer. And then it kind of shifted. So I think it would be interesting if you could also, this could also last for hours, I'm sure, but I think for people to get a high level understanding of what socialist economies kind of looked like throughout history. I think in particular, maybe an easy comparison could be, Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, for example, centralized versus market socialism. Because, yeah, I think that helped. I think one of the things that's kind of lost in a lot of these types of discussions is that I think a lot of people are willing to give like slack when talking about capitalism and different types of capitalism, to where, if you show a libertarian the problems with capitalism, they say, no, that's crony capitalism or something like that. But whenever you're talking about socialism, there seems to be only like one, they try to pigeonhole you into like, there's one, monolithic type of socialist economics and it's failed every time. But I think it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yes. So, I mean, several things to say. I think I would generally, speaking about why socialism seemed like an answer in the 50s, I'd really encourage just an honest engagement and just critical debates, pluralist debates about the history of really existing socialism, taking serious the historical context and the kind of obvious limits that you have in this capitalist world market. And right away, from after the Bolshevist Revolution, you have counter-revolution sponsored by the West and armies attacking. And it's like a very hostile environment. I think we have to take that seriously. We also have to take seriously the critiques of internal dissidents, I think, who were the best in articulating the limits and the contradiction of the system. I think all of those things have to be taken into account, neither romanticizing nor demonizing. The context, for sure, in the world of the 1950s, you basically have, most of the world was colonized previously, or in some kind of, if China wasn't technically colonized, I mean, in a way by Japan, but so the regions that weren't technically colonized were just there was a heavy influence by the colonizers and imperialists. And so from the perspective of much of the world, you look at the Soviet Union, which was a farmer state and which is very rapidly industrializing. And so this seemed like a relatively attractive model. In There's an interesting book called Planning Democracy by Michal Menon. I'm not sure if I pronounce him correctly. He's a US-based historian of India. And he argues that, takes India as an example. He basically says that Indian planners kind of imported, is not the right word. They basically asked Soviet planners to join them and to explain to them how you engage in planning. But they didn't want this Soviet-style kind of authoritarian planning, so try to bring it together with more participation in a very contradictory way. And I think that brings me to properly answering your question. So this kind of central planning, even if in the case of India you try to organize in a more participatory way, has this kind of problem where the central planning and the way it was constructed, it kind of technocratically has the correct answer. It figures out the best allocation of resources, optimal, like an optimal result. There's a question of a problem with technocracy because why would you want to have participation? You already have
Right.
the correct answer. What is the participatory councils? What are they gonna figure out if the planners already figured out everything? And so Soviet planning, the Soviet central planning had, I think this is one of the big problems, central output quota. So it was called material balance planning. It was not as technically advanced as it could be today. It's basically manually adjusting kind of sectoral inputs and outputs to create a relatively coherent allocation. And then you basically have central output quotas. The Central Planning Commission tells the local enterprises what to produce. And then they produce it. The local enterprises don't directly engage with each other. It's a big lesson that kind of reformers draw in later years, that this is kind of what would be necessary. You would need to allow, and this is also under the influence of the Austrian critique. So the Austrian economists critique that in planning. They argue that generally in planning, actually they just critique central planning. If you have a central planning commission that is trying to figure out everything, there's a lot of knowledge that's embodied in time and place that people just have. They can't easily communicate to a central planning agency. They might also not want to communicate it, especially in an authoritarian context, like in really existing socialism. But they might also not be able to do it. And so this kind of planning is happening on a basis of very limited information. There's lots of problems with that. This is kind of an important critique of central planning. It's not a critique of all planning. It's just a critique of heavily centralized planning. Yeah. So this is the kind of limit with that. It's the kind of lesson for a more democratic planning, that enterprises should be allowed to engage with each other. There's something that was tried to a certain extent in market socialist Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
It's the other case you mentioned. And this is a complicated case because essentially, I mean, it's not a political democracy, but they try to experiment with worker self-management to a degree, to unprecedented degree. And so it's good that this is definitely an advance, that enterprises are allowed to choose their own suppliers and so on and so forth. But they go a bit far, and basically it ends up being a socialist market economy in the sense that you basically have worker cooperatives who compete on a market, and it's a full-fledged market. And so what you right away have is, when they experiment with that, is a return of cyclical crisis, because this is a market economy. So basically all the economic actors, they're making decisions without consulting the other enterprises, especially for investment. This is a problem. You don't coordinate investment. There might be over capacity. Everyone invests. Once you have a larger share of the pie, you have overcapacity. It's a huge waste. Maybe if there's underinvestment, you have a lot of needs that are not being met, which is a problem because you can't quickly adjust investment. This is something you need to train workers, build factories, buy machines, and so on. So there's a lack of coordination, and because of that, you have cyclical crisis, you have regional inequality, which feeds in kind of with the kind of ethnic conflicts between different regions, and so on and so forth. Having said all of this, so I personally share this critique that a lot of the advocates of democratic planning have of Yugoslavia. But to be fair, we also, again, this is a situation of world context. So this is a small economy in a capitalist world market. It suffers, as a lot of poorer countries do. It suffers from dependence on foreign credit. There's a debt crisis. So there's all of that. And it's also just the single case that we have of kind of vague market socialism. So I'm not a market socialist, but I'll give that to the market socialists. To be fair, it's a limited databases, but it does kind of indicate that the critique is kind of correct.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when I talk to some of my friends from ex-Yugoslav countries, they all mention, their parents or grandparents being part of these cooperative structures that largely don't exist or may not exist, definitely not as to the same extent as they used to. But yeah, it is interesting, I think,
Yeah.
to think, there was an economy where at one point where there were so many cooperatives or as the main kind of like organizational structure, I think is pretty interesting. So yeah, I think like having, knowing, like hearing you kind of talk about these two specific examples, Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, one of the things that I think is interesting is that they both, I guess, kind of lack, which kind of, I guess, is the part of the reason why you're so interested in and are in California to explore, public investment and public banks is, you know, I like there wasn't so much thinking. I didn't hear much about finance when hearing about the Soviet economy and the Yugoslav economy. I guess that being maybe like the secret sauce of what they missed, of what how maybe could have pulled maybe more off if they had wanted to, or if they could have. The other thing that comes to mind for me as well is just computation. Of course, you've said like nowadays probably the Soviet Union could have gotten, probably could have computed a lot better or a lot more if it had the type of computing resources that we have access to today. So sometimes I wonder maybe it was just all we needed was enough compute. But so getting to your writing, I wanted to talk about. So you write that finance is a form of economic planning in that financial systems, including central banks and index funds, share characteristics with traditional central planning mechanisms and can serve tools for coordinating economic development. So I think there's like a really funny question that I wanted to ask is that, does this mean in some ways that the libertarians are right? In that we actually do live in some sort of totalitarian socialist system already because, the state exists and it manages the economy to some degree. And I think it's also funny to note that like generally libertarians tend to be hyper skeptical of central banks as well. But yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I think it's complicated to answer to. I think there's like, I mean, with the let's
Sure,
say the
sure.
US style libertarians, the right-wing libertarians, I think they sometimes have a point and then they completely like
Yeah,
they draw the complete wrong
definitely.
directions
Yeah.
or it's embedded in really problematic other views. This is kind of my impression frequently. Polanyi has this, Karl Polanyi, the Austrian economic historian, economic anthropologist, has this wonderful quote that laissez-faire was planned and planning was
Mm,
not. When talking about the classical liberalism, not neoliberalism, but like 19th century British style liberalism. And by this he means that one side just means laissez-faire was planned. He said like this is a deliberate effort to commodify and to
mm,
extend the market, which is kind of true for neoliberalism. But by the second part, this planning was not planned. What he means is that central banks emerge, and he specifically talks about central banks. As planning, central banks emerge as a kind of necessary corrective to protect societies and protect also the economy from free markets. By which he means that you have, and we couldn't translate this lesson into kind of recent decades. We've had financialization for, I'd say, at least 70 years. So by which the increasing relevance
mhm.
of finance for capitalist accumulation, for the kind of for generating profits, finance has been so important. And we've had financialization because there's been a problem of generating enough profit opportunities for leading corporations. And therefore, what they did was kind of channeling more of their surpluses, which they held in liquid form. They didn't know what to invest in because there was not enough profit possibility. So they channeled a lot of that into financial markets. And at the same time, governments were trying to solve their kind of spending crisis that they had in the 1970s. And they were kind of one of the way they were doing this was to deregulate financial markets so there was enough credit for everyone. So those things come together.
Hmm.
Now I lost my train of thought. You can cut this out. I'll keep answering in a second. What did I originally talk
The
about?
70 years.
Financialization. Oh, I was
Laissez-faire
fried
was
because
planned.
of unregular sleep. Okay, so you basically have this financialization trend, and finance becomes so much more important, and you have a kind of finance becomes empowered within the kind of different kind of capital actors. Finance capital becomes really important. You have rise of institutional investors. The most modern one are asset managers, and banks are getting bigger. And you already have this kind of narrative. Becomes very important after 2008 in the global north, that banks are too big to fail. You already see it earlier if you look at the global south debt crisis of the 1970s and 80s. You occasionally you have the situation that you have huge private banks that were lending, were engaged in kind of speculation in the global south. There's a debt crisis, and governments jump in to stabilize the banks because they realize that if this bank goes bankrupt, we have a huge financial crisis. Because it's such a powerful actor, this is going to affect so many other actors. Basically, banks become too big to fail. And so, in this kind of situation where finance becomes so important, and there's so many big financial actors that if they go bankrupt, there's going to be a huge economic crisis. Central banks right away step in to stabilize markets and use the kind of new financial tools to kind of direct markets. There's also so in a sense this is Polanyi. It wasn't planning, wasn't planned. That it's just kind of becomes regularly. It
was a
comes
response
almost naturally
to
if you want to pursue this policy.
all these conditions, I guess, happening. Yeah.
Yes. 100%. Yes, but it's, to a certain extent, one has to add that there's also a kind of policy discourse that by conservatives that they're complaining that governments are engaging in too much social spending, and this is the stupid elections every 4 years, and governments are too shy to have population swallow this. I don't know, is it a bitter pill?
Yeah.
Big pill? What do you say in English? Yeah, so they're kind of too shy to do this, and central banks, also in policy discourses, it becomes a kind of a technocratic narrative that maybe we should have those expert-driven, but actually really neoliberal central banks, and they're gonna do it. They're gonna be the bad guys, and they're gonna push through those policies, and other kind of depoliticized, non-electorally accountable actors. They're gonna pursue those policies that governments are too weak.
Right. So in many ways, like they were able to depoliticize austerity in a way, or to like the path towards implementing austerity via depoliticized routes, or just routes of power that are not accountable to people. Like you're not voted in to the central bank or something like that, not by, the general population.
Yeah. So I mean, in a sense, it's solving a real crisis of lack of profitability in stagflation and so on. So like you have those crises, and the whole shift of neoliberalism, it manages to restore profitability, which you need in capitalism. I guess the other trajectory would have been this is what left-wing social democrats wanted at the time, to extend planning and to democratize it and to basically transition into democratic socialism. So that was blocked. There was a blocked path, or a path that didn't win. And so it succeeded in its plan and its ambitions in restoring profitability, but it did so at a tremendous social cost. And so in a way, it was not unpolitical. Like, it was a very political decision, but it had this esprit of being, this is just the experts, and with their economics degrees, they're gonna pick the right answer, which is not a political question, it's just figuring out the correct answer. Right. So this kind of spirit, central banks are very important for that.
Yeah, as if it was a standardized test. You have to pick the right answer to solve these problems, which are complex and multifaceted. I think one of the things that is interesting then, if we accept this thesis that like basically markets are planned, they are always planned by the thing. I think I don't know if you've seen that meme of like I think it's like Star Trek, like a scene from Star Trek. We have like economics and law, and it, one guy is like, I think it's like law saying we're friends, and economics is like, no, we're not. That oftentimes people who are like, free market types don't like to admit that markets are planned and that they are like enforced through law and policy, is kind of like how I read it. That like, to me, I don't know, like law is like a very technocratic kind of thing to do, and not in a bad way or anything like that, but like, implementing policy is planning. Like, I don't know. I don't know if we should call policy just planning at this point.
Sorry, I couldn't process the meme. What was economics and law?
Like they're
who's
two,
a friend
like the two guys from Star Trek are like standing next to each other, I think it was. And law is saying we're both friends, and economics is saying no, we're not. Yeah.
Interesting. Wait, I need the sours me. Still not sure if I 100% get it though, but like I can relate it to. So what was your
I was just
question?
making a comment about
Um,
it's a funny yeah.
yeah,
One of the things I guess maybe the
it's
actual question I'm trying to get to is that so what then like I've noted is that neoliberalism has somehow been able to profess a kind of free market fundamentalism while at the same time practicing planning via policy. Is that like a
mhm,
correct way
mhm.
of thinking about it?
Yes, yes. I think that's a very good way, and I don't think I've done a good job in answering your previous question completely. I think this, yeah. So this kind of planning by central banks and like the point here, I think to understand is that there is in the 80 like with neoliberalism there is a
Mm,
decrease of planning in some sense. Like states are less capable at shaping the outcomes of the market to a certain extent. But then it's not a complete return to a
mm,
spontaneous market for sure. Also because there's huge corporations who are organizing. Markets aren't that spontaneous anymore, and it's very hard to imagine kind of getting back to it. The point I'm trying to make is that central bank planning and other forms of like technocratic planning emerge because it's capitalism can't go back to this kind of Adam Smith style British 19th century family capitalism. It just can't do that. Production is industrialized. Everything is super interdependent. It can't go back. So it can't also just do away with all sorts of planning that emerged for a reason historically to stabilize markets. It just doesn't want, it's just a policy transformation and like kind of doing away with a lot of the social rights in order to restore profitability. I think that's
mm.
what's actually happening. Yes.
Um, one of the things, yeah.
Sorry, just maybe we can cut this out, but like, what was the second part of your question? My brain is not fresh today.
uh,
I'm very sorry.
I mean, we're just
There
saying
was
about the kind of contradiction of
central banks.
neoliberalism professing free markets while
Yeah.
practicing planning.
Okay, I know what was I gonna say. I think one of the people who really one of the people that I learned a lot from in thinking about those relations was Johanna Bockman, and she's a economic anthropologist and a historian, and she studied the rise of neoliberalism in terms of kind of the transformation of economics and economic knowledge production. And she always makes this point, and I think I agree with this, is that neoliberalism is not about doing away with the state. Neoliberalism actually advocates a really strong state, but a lean state. So it's a state that's centered on enabling profit maximization for companies, and that's the main thing it should do. But in doing that, it can even be authoritarian. It can be really ruthless. Think about the Chicago Boys and Pinochet in Chile, but think about maybe Anwar Sadat in Egypt and like other the earliest experiments with neoliberalism. This is in authoritarian states, and it goes together really perfectly. The state should be really forceful in pushing for fair, and it has a limited kind of space it navigates in, but in that space, I can be really powerful according
Mm.
to neoliberalism.
So, one of the things I also wanted to touch on was China. So, based on kind of like the little bit that I know about China, maybe a little bit more than average, but not definitely not an expert by any means. But it seems that there's kind of like this contradiction when people talk about China, where China is both a beneficiary of economic liberalization policies and as well a socialist state. Yeah, but one of the things that I've noticed about China or that I kind of understood is that one of the ways that they seem to be quite different compared to Western countries is their use of public finance and the way that they do finance generally. They still definitely have financial bubbles and suffer some of those things as we've seen in the past with the real estate crash that happened a while back. There was like this also, was it last year or so, where they said like I can't remember exactly what it was, but the Chinese state essentially popped the bubble themselves. But yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts are on China in this question around planning and markets.
Hmm. So before I answer this, I need to say that I'm not a expert in China. I've been interested in Chinese history and economic policy for a while, and I've roughly followed some debates, but I'm
Sure,
absolutely not an expert.
sure.
So take it with a grain of salt. But I think what I'm comfortable, I mean, and it's certainly not how I imagine democratic economic planning, but like I realize there's debates about whether there is some kind of levels of participation. Some people argue that authoritarianism is a bit kind of demonized. It's more democratic than one would imagine. Others say that's not true. I can't get into those debates because I'm
Hmm.
not knowledgeable to comment on that. What I'm comfortable in saying is that it definitely shows that, so it's definitely the success of China shows that this has been neither complete central planning, for sure. There's no central output quotas for the overall economy.
Hmm.
It's not that kind of planning. It's also not laissez-faire, for sure. And it's very important to note that I think Giovanni Arrighi, economic historian, historical sociology, makes this in Adam Smith, makes this case in Adam Smith and Bishing, but others have made this point. Joseph Stiglitz has made the point at the time, the 1990s and 2000s, that China was the country that didn't follow the shock doctrine of a rapid introduction of laissez-faire, like we've seen in many parts of the global south, and we've seen with really existing socialism in the east, in Russia and in other countries, countries in sub-Saharan Africa, countries in Latin America. You have a kind of rapid privatization, and you have the development economics to the lost decade where living standards are decreasing tremendously, and you have huge crises. And then you have actual existing crony capitalism emerging in Russia because you basically sell off all the state assets very quickly, and you have a bunch of oligarchs emerging that are in nowhere, in no sense of the word, any more democratic than what was there beforehand.
Hmm.
Absolutely not. Quite the contrary. So anyway, so it shows that that's a success of a model that was neither laissez-faire nor complete central planning, old school central planning, but is, I think, arguably what it has, and which could certainly be imagined in much more democratically, there's a dominance to a certain extent of the political over the economic. Even still, there's a capacity to kind of override particular interests of capital. There's a
Hmm.
capacity to steer investment that no Western country has. And I think we see this in debates about
Yeah.
the energy transition, that basically the rise of
Hmm.
solar energy in China, this is the success of being able to engage in intersectoral allocation of investment, like picking sectors, which is something that many Western countries have been struggling with. Brett Christophers, the economic geographer, has made this point really wonderfully, that fossil fuels are still highly profitable. And asset managers who have the driving motive of profit maximization, they're struggling with decarbonization because the returns on
Hmm.
renewables just aren't high enough. And even though renewables are profitable and they're getting cheaper and cheaper, it's just not rapid decarbonization on the scale we would need. And China is much more successful, but from a much lower standard in building up a solar energy sector and so on and so forth. I don't want to romanticize or realize this massive fossil fuel consumption and so on and so forth. I think this is this may be the main lesson. This is me being biased because I'm interested in the democratization of investment.
Hmm.
I think this is the big story here, that there's a capacity to steer investment for the green transition that can be imagined in a much more participatory way, for sure, can be imagined in varieties of ways, but this is the big
Yeah.
story for me
I
here.
mean, that's definitely something that for me has been like a common theme over the past year or two. Is kind of, you know, seeing the rise of China, sitting here from the West, it just feels kind of, I don't know. Sometimes when people try to criticize China to me, sometimes but they're winning in many ways over us. When there's something like you may not like
Mhm.
maybe certain aspects
Mhm.
of their system, but like it's definitely worth taking a look at and admitting, that this is happening. But so, continuing on alternatives to maybe what we may be familiar with, what are some of the novel alternatives to capitalist planning that you're looking at? Maybe to some bits of detail, there are different schools of thoughts around economic planning beyond, Soviet style economic planning, but also just within democratic economic planning. There's a lot of different ways to express your voice in a democracy and like sharing what your desire is that you want your economic system to provide for. So what are some of those alternatives that you're seeing out there that you think are the most interesting?
It's a million-dollar question. I, the, this is so. Just to give an impression to people who are not familiar with this debate, there's probably 10 or more full-scale models of what a democratic economy could look like, and that features democratic planning. And it's a very complicated debate and there's very different visions. And to me, I think the most interesting ones, I call them Polanyian planning. And they're basically a kind of a way of imagining planning. And this is Karl Polanyi, I've mentioned him, he's a very important economic historian, who very early on in the socialist calculation debate kind of responds to both Otto Neurath, who suggests total plans of a complete central allocation of resources, even though he imagines it as a very democratic process and as a kind of election. There's referenda over which total plan you're going to pick, but still it's a total plan. So he disagrees with that, but he also disagrees with Ludwig von Mises, Austrian economist, who basically says there can be no rational form of economic planning under socialism. He disagrees with both of them. And so the two main things that he imagines, is maybe three main things I'd say, is a kind of, he calls it in a sense negotiated prices. And then second important one for me is democratic decision making over investment. The third one would be a relatively egalitarian redistribution, but the third one is derived from the others. So if you imagine there would be social ownership, maybe all of society owns the means of production, but the people who actually do work in enterprises, they have the right to use those means of production on their own. There's this self-management at the workplace. And this is kind of a bit convoluted, and maybe I shouldn't go into detail too much. I'm also still learning a little bit about this. This is the original question of socialist calculation. There's basically the ideas that Polanyi has is that that be prices, because they do make things comparable. But there's a certain sense of acknowledgement of the critique of that prices are also very limited, especially in capitalism, that they should be negotiated. They should feature the social cost of action for Polanyi. That's the idea, that prices they should really they should reflect the social and ecological costs of action. This is the kind of
the
accounting
equities that capitalism doesn't
very
take into account.
Yes.
If you knew that
Yes.
the one product is cheaper by 50%, but it spills oil into the river versus another one, maybe you would change your choice.
Yes, 100%. So yeah, and this is a very technical and complicated question of what such prices could do. If you want to read more about this, maybe Aaron Beninoff in the most to read the new editions of the New Left Review. He has a kind of a model that's very similar. My colleagues, they have like a model where costs are basically based on labor time, which they take to be an approximation for the social costs, good approximation, and then CO2 emissions and raw material consumption, which they take to be good approximations of planetary boundaries. You could imagine different kind of models, but like this is different kind of ideas of how kind of prices should reflect social and ecological costs. As very similar to idea in cybernetics. It's very different, but in a way a very similar idea, where the kind of indicators and parameters, and prices are kind of indicators, should enable a local kind of enterprise to act kind of socially and ecologically responsible, and those kind of prices should basically do that. That's the main idea. But I don't want to go into too much detail. Imagining that there is such a kind of a price system that features those kind of externalities and is a much better approximation of social and ecological costs. The other big thing is that either, depending on the price system, there are no surpluses, or if there are surpluses. So if you're an enterprise and you have there's no profit that you're going to keep. Like, you're not a kind of worker-owned cooperative where you make a huge profit and then you get to just pay this out, or you have a disproportionate share over societal investment. The surpluses, they flow off into kind of sectoral bodies which are democratic in some sense. They could be multi-stakeholder, like the main stakeholders that are affected by the decision that they're represented, like the consumers, the citizens, the workers, and so on. You could imagine something like that. You could imagine a mixture of, you have a couple of technical experts that are engaging in complexity reduction, and then this is mixed to sortition style. People are just enter via sortition. You could imagine different kind of forms of democracy. I don't want to pick the best one. There's debates about that. But you have those sectoral bodies, and they basically deliberate over the allocation of investment in the sector. So that the different companies aren't kind of disorganized and allocated investment. There's a space for debating investment and for coordinating it. This is I think the big idea. And on a societal level, you could have something like a national investment authority. Let's assume there's still nation states. We're not far off in the future. There's a kind of democratic institution which is shaped by elections and by large-scale political processes that might be democracy could be further democratized, another topic. Let's imagine there's a very democratic process at the societal level. Yeah, this can shape then intersectoral allocation of investment. So which sector gets which share of investment. This shouldn't be only based on productivity and profitability, because car industry is insanely productive in the sense that work can be very effectively rationalized. But it doesn't mean that the car industry is more important than hospitals, where it's much harder to maximize profits by with heavy technology use. So there should be a more conscious decision over allocating resources than just letting the market do it.
Hmm.
Yeah. So intersectoral at the societal level, there's a conscious allocation of resources for investment, and then there's sectoral self-management in determining how exactly expend them. Because you can also, some share can also go to kind of regional committees which decide over public expenditure,
Right.
parks, swimming pools, and so on and so forth. You can imagine it like that. But beyond that, there's self-management on the local level. The workers get to decide how they want to construct their workplace, what they want to produce, and so on and so forth. So it would be a mixture of more autonomy on the local level, but at the same time, kind of democratic bodies at different scales that decide over investment and
Right. Yeah.
finance.
I
Yeah,
mean, that sounds very rational to me.
I think, yeah, thanks. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's funny just because I mean, I guess I'm imagining the types of reactions that some people may have to some of this. That I mean, I think what's important to note is that this is quite different than how the socialist economies of the Soviet Union or Yugoslavia worked. It maybe takes, and it also takes like the learnings from those mistakes, and it provides something different from capitalism. And yeah, I think to me, what's also interesting as part of that is that your work has, especially your writing, had a lot to do with finance, but finance seems to be a really understood, I guess, like field in among the left, kind of generally. I don't want to make like broad strokes, but it tends to be something that the left does not engage in, or kind of has I guess, a kind of allergic reaction to oftentimes. I'm curious if that, like, is that, I mean, in one sense, like, is finance basically kind of like the underlooked, like, key to a socialist politics in the modern world? Is that potentially the case? And yeah, how I'm curious how, like, when you present your work, do you ever get kind of like people being like, finance? Why would we be doing that?
I mean, I think I agree with that in the sense I qualified it by I think because I'm not sure if I have a good impression of the like what's the overall status of progressive politics. But let's say I think in some spaces, I would say in some imaginations of a different kind of society, I think people underestimate how
Yeah.
important finance is at the moment for different kind of reasons. I mean, first of all, because of financialization, we have a world where finance is so powerful and where investment is increasingly socialized in the hands of institutional investors already to a certain extent. So is this just for practical reasons, is immensely important topic of, but also because much of the crisis we have, I would argue, and so let's take climate crisis, which is I think the biggest one, such an existential crisis. We also have a care crisis. I think both of them, in a way, can be related to the problem of having a primacy of the profit motive. The profit motive is what is the driving force of the capitalist economy. And what the profit motive can be very wonderful if things that are socially desirable that a society wants, if they're profitable, that's cool. I think, who gives this an example? I think this is in the People's Republic of Weimar. They give, I think, or it's just Lee Phillips somewhere else. He argues that he takes the example of
Mm,
PrEP, I think,
right.
HIV medicine. He says, this is, there's been activism to push for this kind of medicine was successful also because there was a way to make this profitable. And therefore they found investors, and it's wonderful that we have this medicine. But there's a lot of things that are profitable that are not as over society, not so desirable for societies, like fossil fuels, still insanely profitable. And we need to decarbonize the economy for the climate crisis. And there's also things that are really desirable that are just aren't as profitable. There's the care crisis. There's a revival of the notion of the Baumol-Kostasis, or sometimes Baumol paradox. The idea that it's very hard to rationalize interpersonal care work and the service sector at large without decreasing the quality of the product. So the idea that you can make care work, you can make childcare in a sense more productive, efficient if you take a share of the day of children, a couple of hours a day, you put them, children go into childcare facilities. In a sense, this becomes more productive because you have fewer people watching more children. And in a sense, this is reasonable and this is really good for children's development to have peers that they can engage with. But at some point, it's like, which is already the reality in many countries, and certainly is in Germany where I normally live, you have too many people, too few people for too many children. The quality of the service just decreases because they can't watch the children properly, they can't encourage, they can't moderate, and so on and so forth. So this becomes a problem, and you can't rationalize childcare and make it 50 times more efficient in this kind of sense. You can make it technically, you can make it better with some technologies and with collective.
We just give them all iPads.
You get the point.
With AI.
So you get them all like this. Yeah. Who is that? I think this is Helen Hester and Nick Cernicek. They say the television is the most important automating technology in childcare at the 20th
iPad
century.
I think iPad might pass it in this day and age.
Might have suppressed this. Yeah. No, it's definitely, 100%. So yeah, there's a sector, and there's a sector, and I mean, now I'm in the US and I realize, normally I say, it's just basically impossible to organize such a sector around the profit motive, but I realize this is happening in the US, but it has very detrimental effects. It's very hard to make this properly profitable, a lot of this work, which is why in many countries it's the state who organize it and the private family. And so the lack of investment that you'll have in some of related sectors due to decreasing profitability, there's also wages that are too low in those sectors. The way to kind of remedy that is to democratize finance and to engage in more deliberate allocation of investment in finance. I think is making a very long point. Let's just get back to this. This is something that shouldn't be based on profitability. It should be based on conscious decision, I would argue. And maybe if it's okay, I'll just say one more thing. There is a literature in academia on the democratization of finance, and there are lots of social movements and there's civil society around democratizing finance. And I think it's often about repoliticizing central banks and subjecting them to proper democratic control. And it's about how to build a cooperative finance and how to extend public banks. When I present in those circles, so my impression is that the ideas that I articulated earlier, people are very open to those ideas. They're very close to how people think about democratizing finance already. And the people who do empirical work on the political economy of finance, I think I get, this might be self-selection bias, maybe it's just the people who come to my presentations, but like I get positive feedback because people are just so fed up with kind of studying de-risking and how finance presently works and just complete failure to facilitate decarbonization. And so people are very open to hearing ideas about how to do things.
Do you ever have like people studying finance coming to your seminars?
Probably not that often, yeah. And the ones who would come would be the heterodox economists. Yeah. This is something I need to move more out, need to engage more outside of my bubble.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been thinking kind of recently is that maybe it should be part of a, left political program to actually create like schools for finance for like a post-capitalist finance schools as a place for people to actually study these things and to begin to try and implement them in practice and to know what they look like. And I think part of that there are existing things already with public banks. You're working on cooperative banks, credit unions, maybe you can say like things that are more democratizing than the traditional corporation is today. Yeah, I guess maybe my last question, I'm actually curious to hear your thoughts on just kind of, maybe this is too broad of a question, but like micro attempts at democratizing finance, if that makes sense. what your thoughts on are they effective? I mean, I'm just thinking in my context in particular with the project that I work on, Bread Cooperative, for example, it is like an attempt at like a small version of trying to do kind of democratized financial system, like configuration for people to engage in, knowing that it's like, I'm doing this knowing that it's an island in a vast ocean of capitalism and finance and the crypto world even more so that works very differently. But I'm just curious on your thoughts on these kinds of like, you know, micro attempts versus like, because I think sometimes we kind of get stuck in this like, yes, the state should do X, but then, I have no levers of power on the state at all. So what do I do about it?
Yes. So I think, I mean, my thinking is shaped by the sociologist Eric Holland Wright in terms of transformation, who I think was one of the progressives who really has a good feeling for how things change in capitalism. And he brings together tries to bring together like a vision of transformation that relates a path of democratic socialism where kind of popular parties, progressive parties that unite kind of different subaltern classes. So you have that kind of route, and you have popular politics, and you pursue an institutional path, and you try to fight for like the space there is within the system, and link this towards a vision where you experiment with cooperatives. He calls it real utopias. Cooperatives are probably the most important ones. And in finance, you could probably think about like kind of credit unions, small cooperative banks, and so on. Definitely, but also not only in finance. And so the idea would be that for a kind of, I mean, there's a question of transformation, and the idea would be that you fight for, within institutions, you fight for a kind of, you defend social rights, of course, but you also push for more space for experiments with something else. And the experiments with something else are, of course, always limited in capitalism to a certain extent, but they also, for a kind of situations, for instance, climate change or the other crises, they push us towards situations where, again, like in the 70s, we end up in a situation where there's an actual chance for pursuing a different overall path. The kind of Fred Block, another sociologist, makes this point that I really like. There's cooperative finance would have a tremendously important role. So any kind of public bank, but also a cooperative financial sector in such a kind of crisis situation, if you have that, they keep on lending and they don't engage in a credit strike or capital strike. So imagine as a kind of situation where you actually would want to pursue a different path and you would want to democratize the economy. And then you have large corporates and they just don't invest anymore and they sabotage the economy. Or they just might honestly feel that there's not going to be profitability, and they're going to withhold profits and surpluses. They create economic turbulence, and so the more you have like a autonomous cooperative financial sector, and you have public banks, and the more resources that you have to keep on lending, the less destabilizing such a crisis would be. That also makes it easier to transition somewhere else because there's not a disruption in the life world of the everyday citizen to the same kind of degree. So this would mediate the kind of the disruption that might happen. The problem with having such a huge disruption and that you have I don't know, I'm not an expert on Venezuela, so I don't want to comment on that, but maybe that's the case. But like that, certainly you can also discuss state socialism. If you have a heavy disruption in the kind of quality of life of the everyday citizen, the kind of coalition that might carry such a transformation, they might fall apart. Maybe there's kind of middle class people, like a professional managerial class, who aren't suffering as much today, and who might feel like, oh, this is getting. I'm not sure if I want to kind of
Right.
stay in this coalition, if I'm happy with the direction the country is going. So the less disruptive such an experience would be, the easier it is to transition, and the less danger there is that there might be an
Right.
authoritarian turn of some sort, where you have kind of elites are sabotaging to a large degree. The coalition is shrinking. You can either kind of clamp down and push through, or it just falls apart. This is a kind of there's a danger of authoritarianism in this kind of recipe as well. So all this to say that a cooperative financial sector would be a great thing for a transformation. You could also imagine, so all this kind of this image that I've painted of kind of sectoral bodies and National Investment Authority, you can totally imagine a cooperative financial sector for some, not for a heavy industry. The things should probably be more negotiated, but like for others, like small scale kind of agriculture services and whatnot, that could be always could be a small scale cooperative sector. And for that, a cooperative financial sector
Mm-hmm.
would probably be a good idea.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for coming on and for sharing your knowledge, giving the context about the socialist calculation debate, markets versus planning, how capitalism also has planning, so it's not such a it's not a binary. Maybe to finish it off, if you want to share with people where they can keep up with you and your work, and maybe also your.
Yeah. I mean, if you wanna follow my work, you can follow me on Blue Sky. I'm transitioning over from X because I get it's not pretty there anymore. And I have a homepage. I'm not even sure what the title of my homepage is, to be honest. Just Google it.
I think it's
It's just
yeah.
Christoph Sorg, which is my name. Yeah. But other than that, also my university page at Humboldt University, I'm just publishing and just updating that one with more recent publications. The book that we have, Creative Construction, is presently also being translated into German by Brumaire. It was published with Bristol University Press. If you have university affiliation, you can maybe help order it there. They're still keeping it behind a very steep price, which academic books frequently have. If you're struggling with that, just shoot me an email. Maybe we can figure out a different way, if you know what I mean. Maybe you also know that there's ways of getting around those huge university prices that I, of course, don't condone. But
Yeah,
like maybe
there are
you find
websites out there.
something there. Our websites, you should know of them. They're making academia possible, and they're making popular work, popular knowledge production possible. So maybe you're going to be successful there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Christoph.
Thank you for having me.